Guys, welcome to Grafted Theology, where we explore the deep and transformative truths of the Christian faith. I'm your host, Drew Witten, and today we're going to be discussing 1 Corinthians 10:13 versus Calvinism. So, 1 Corinthians 10:13 presents a significant, in my opinion, a significant challenge to Calvinistic determinism. It reads, "No temptation has overcome you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." This passage affirms two core truths. One, believers will not face any temptation that is beyond what they are able to endure. And then two, with every temptation, God will provide a way of escape so that they will be able to endure it. The grammar and context of this verse makes these truths especially strong. The verb will provide is a future indicative, which indicates that God definitively and actively provides the way of escape for every temptation. Further, the purpose clause, so that you will be able to endure it, shows the divine intent is not merely theoretical, but practical. God's provision aims to result in the believer's actual endurance. This passage presents God's faithfulness as the foundation of the believer's confidence that they will not be overcome by temptation, but will genuinely have a way to endure it. In other words, it presupposes that the believer genuinely has the real God-enabled ability to either sin or endure. So consider the following scenario. Bob is a believer. Bob faces a temptation. Bob sins rather than taking the way of escape. According to 1 Corinthians 10:13, Bob was not tempted beyond what he was able to endure. God faithfully provided a real way of escape, and Bob was able to endure. But Calvinism teaches otherwise. The Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 3 or section 3, part 1, confirms that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, including every sin, thought, and desire. In other words, Bob's sin was decreed from eternity and meticulously brought about by God through secondary causes that are also decreed. So ends and means. So here's the dilemma. Either Bob was genuinely able to make or take the way of escape and not sin, as the passage says, or Bob was not able to do anything other than sin because God decreed it, as Calvinism requires. If Calvinism is true, then Bob's sin was unchangeably determined, metaphysically necessary, and the only possible outcome given God's eternal decree. There was no possible world within Calvinism where Bob could actually take the way of escape. Thus, the way of escape was never truly available to him in any meaningful sense, given God's decree. Bob could not have done otherwise. One might argue that Bob could have done otherwise if God had decreed differently. But this only shifts the necessity back one step. Given the actual decree, Bob's sin was inevitable. It was impossible for him to have taken it since his sin was not merely foreknown or permitted. It was metaphysically necessary and the only possible outcome given God's eternal determination of all things. His desire, will, and outcome were all predetermined. Thus, the promise in 1 Corinthians 10:13 becomes empty, a declaration of God's faithfulness that offers no real assurance if God is the one determining the failure. Calvinism also often appeals to a distinction between two levels of reality to resolve this tension: the ultimate level, God's eternal decree, and the storyline level, the created order where real choices and opportunities appear to happen. According to this view, the way of escape exists only on the storyline level as a genuine opportunity for the believer. But the ultimate decree ensures the believer's desires and choices are fixed to lead away from taking that escape. However, this distinction ultimately fails to solve the dilemma because it ignores the full weight of what the ultimate issue entails. According to Calvinism, God not only decreed that Bob would fail to take the way of escape, he actively planned, orchestrated, and made it metaphysically necessary that Bob would sin. Bob's sin was not just permitted or allowed to happen, it was effectually caused by God's sovereign decree, including the exact desires, circumstances, and decisions leading to that sin. No rogue molecule, just the beginning, the end, the effects, the cause, all of it. So this means that Bob was not truly able to endure or escape sin in any real sense given God's eternal decree. The way of escape, while present as a circumstance in the created order, was never a genuine alternative available to Bob because God decreed it from eternity that Bob would reject it. So God scripted that Bob would reject it, and that's the sufficient reason that Bob rejects it. So thus the promise of a way of escape in 1 Corinthians 10:13 becomes incoherent within Calvinistic determinism. The ultimate reality is that Bob's sin was necessary and God authored every detail, making escape impossible. The storyline level appearance of choice cannot override or nullify this necessity. The tension remains unresolved. Calvinism insists on exhaustive divine causation of sin, but Scripture clearly promises real, God provided escape from temptation. This is not a trivial semantic distinction, but a fundamental conflict between divine determinism and the believer's genuine ability to resist sin. So here's why I think the Calvinistic response fails. The Calvinist might respond by saying, but God did provide a way of escape. Bob just didn't take it, right? I think that this is a critical move in their defense, but it collapses under scrutiny. If God decreed from all eternity that Bob would not take the way of escape, then God never intended for Bob to endure the temptation. The way of escape was never a live possibility for Bob. It couldn't be actualized. He couldn't realize that reality. It was a road God built, but then eternally decreed Bob would never walk it. To say Bob didn't take the way of escape is misleading in a deterministic framework, or that Bob even wanted to take the way of escape. The honest Calvinist must say Bob could not have taken the way of escape because God did not decree that he would, or decree that he would even want to. Bob's sin was the only metaphysical possibility within the Calvinistic worldview. It's the only thing that Bob could have done. This eliminates the meaningfulness of God's faithfulness in this passage. If God promises, he promises this, a way of escape, while also ensuring through an eternal decree that a person will never take it, and they can't take it, and they won't take it. That promise becomes deceptive. It's like offering a key to a locked door and then welding the door shut while claiming you could have escaped if you wanted to. You could have. Some Calvinists recognize this and then retreat into compatibilism. They will say that Bob acted freely according to his strongest desire, and that God is faithful because Bob still did what he wanted. But this doesn't solve the problem. It only reframes it and shifts it back another step. If God decreed both Bob's desires and actions, ends and means, then the promise of a way of escape was never real in any meaningful sense. It was an illusion of possibility. Others may say this promise only applies to the elect, or this was a moment of discipline. But Bob is a believer in this example. And even if discipline was God's purpose, the promise of 1 Corinthians 10:13 doesn't say God will sometimes provide a way of escape, depending on his secret purposes. It says God will provide a way of escape so that the believer will be able to endure it. The promise is framed in universal, unqualified terms for believers. Calvinism tries to avoid this dilemma by redefining terms, key terms, but this redefinition is an equivocation, a shifting of meaning that hides the problem. Paul says Bob was able, he doesn't necessarily refer to Bob, but the verse says that he should have been able, was able to endure. That is, Bob had the real God enabled capacity to resist sin at that moment. Calvinism redefines able to mean able only if God had decreed it differently. This is like saying a bird with clipped wings is able to fly if only it had wings. The ability becomes purely hypothetical and not actual. This equivocation makes the promise of 1 Corinthians 10:13 meaningless. The promise that God provides a way of escape loses its force if that way was never actually available to Bob because God determined he would not take it, nor desired to take it. So the only way for a Calvinist to avoid the dilemma is to reinterpret the promise. They must say that something along the lines of the way of escape doesn't mean a real ability to choose otherwise, or that able to endure doesn't mean the believer could actually have endured if God didn't decree it. Or maybe God is faithful doesn't mean he ensures opportunity, but only that his plan is being carried out, even if that plan includes the believer's failure. This reinterpretation undermines the passage entirely. It twists God's promise of help and escape into a declaration that everything unfolds exactly as God ordained, even your failures. But if that's all Paul meant, then the encouragement is gone. The passage would mean you'll never be tempted beyond what you're able unless God ordains that you sin, in which case your ability and the way of escape weren't real. That's not comfort. That's fatalism cloaked in theological language. Just go look up the definition of fatalism. So, by contrast, the non Calvinist reading takes the text at face value. Bob's temptation was not beyond what he could endure. God faithfully provided a way of escape. Bob had the real, God enabled ability to resist, but Bob chose to sin. God did not decree or determine that outcome. Bob is morally responsible because he could have done otherwise. This preserves the integrity of God's promise and God's character. His faithfulness is demonstrated in genuinely providing the means of escape, not in scripting failures as part of a hidden plan. So, to reiterate and recap how Calvinism contradicts this passage, considering the following. 1. Scripture promises that in every temptation, God provides a way of escape so that the believer is able to endure. 2. Being able to endure necessarily entails the genuine possibility of enduring rather than sinning. 3. Calvinism teaches that all choices, including sin, are eternally decreed, rendered certain and necessitated by God. Westminster Confession, chapter 3, part 1. 4. If an act is eternally decreed and rendered certain, it is impossible to do otherwise. Number 5. Therefore, under Calvinism, no believer who sins could have genuinely endured contradicting Scripture. So, in conclusion, if just one verse, like 1 Corinthians 10:13, reveals that humans have real, God-given opportunity to do otherwise than they actually did, then Calvinism's determinism fails. This passage doesn't merely challenge Calvinism, it directly contradicts it. Calvinism must either abandon its view of exhaustive divine determinism or strip this passage of all meaningful assurance. Either way, the system fails. If this still feels too abstract, consider a real moment from your life. Just think of a time when you gave in to temptation. We've all at some point given in to temptation. And according to Calvinistic determinism, you didn't just happen to sin, you had to. God decreed not only the temptation, but also your failure. It was written down. God, God decreed it before the foundation of the world for you to sin, and the means in which you would sin, and how you would sin, and the thoughts you would have, and the action, and all that it entailed, the ends and the means of it. He decreed that for you from the beginning. It was part of his plan for you. So whatever escape was theoretically there wasn't actually available to you, not in any real actionable sense. He planned for your failure. He scripted it. But 1 Corinthians 10:13 assures us that God is faithful to provide, and provides a genuine way out, a path we can actually take that only makes sense if we're truly able to respond. This promise of God's faithfulness requires a real moral freedom, not the illusion of choice within a predetermined script. And that's something Calvinism cannot provide.